I hope you've enjoyed my interview with Maya as much as I have, and now have a better understanding of celiac disease, gluten sensitivity, and why this is such an important topic for our bones and overall health. Make sure to check out Maya's website, where she has some great recipes and information. And she gave me a special link directly to her tahini cookies, which have some calcium and bone nutrients in them. So check it out. I haven't made them yet, but I am certainly going to. So bye for now, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Welcome, Maya. I'm really excited to have you here because this topic is so important. And I know we've brought up things about gluten and celiac before, but we're going to delve in deeper because this is just something so critical to anyone who's concerned about osteoporosis, bone health, or even just overall health. And it's something that's near and dear to my heart because truthfully, my husband would not be alive today if we hadn't discovered the issue with gluten. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Margie, for having me. I listened to that episode with your husband, and it is incredible. If y'all haven't listened to that yet, go back and listen to it. It's amazing. And I'm so happy to be here because I know you truly understand the impact of gluten-related disorders on people's lives. And so thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Well, I always like to hear the backstory. How did you get to be this gluten diva who's helping so many people? How did that start for you? It didn't just appear, right?
Right. I love that, by the way, gluten diva. I might use that. So yeah, it all started for me in my early 20s. I was working at this kind of food as medicine culinary school, and we were teaching chefs how to teach or how to cook health supportive meals and for people with certain disease states. So whether it be cancer, diabetes, heart disease, etc. And so that really piqued my interest in nutrition. But at the same time, I started having digestive issues. And it was those two things that came together that really started both my health journey and then the path towards eventually becoming a nutritionist. So years followed after that. I continued to have these digestive issues, continued to try to get answers at doctors, and just kept getting told that I had IBS because I had IBS-like symptoms. And eventually, I started having additional symptoms. So I became very underweight, stopped having a period. I had joint pain, joint stiffness and achiness, especially in my hands. And that made my job in the culinary world really difficult because I was using my hands every day. And then, I just had that kind of brain fog, heavy fatigue. And it wasn't until I was smack dab in the middle of my graduate program for nutrition when I was finally diagnosed with celiac. And to be honest, it was kind of a relief to find out what had been going on for most of my 20s at that point. And, it was from that point forward where I just became really passionate about both raising awareness around gluten-related disorders and really getting people the help and support that I was looking for the entire time I was struggling. And I feel, so lucky to be where I am now and to be able to help people and change this experience and change what is commonly the story around celiac disease and gluten sensitivity too, where people go for years and years and years without getting answers and then really have to work on their health after that point. So I'm also happy to have, platforms like this and meet people like you that allow me to share this story and share with others.
Oh, well, I think it's so important. I mean, I even think of my husband, I'm not going to get into it, but the fact that we went to so many doctors, amazing doctors, and
Yes.
it wasn't even because, well, why don't you tell everyone the problem? What can be the symptoms? A lot of people think, oh, gluten, celiac, I have stomach issues, but that's so often that's not the case. So why don't you tell everybody about you had symptoms, as you're saying, joint and different things, but what do you see with all the people that you work with?
Yeah, these things are, kind of thought of as digestive disorders, but they really aren't. They affect the whole body. And some people will not have any digestive symptoms at all. And some people will say, hey, I'm having like perfect bowel movements. I don't have any problem with gluten. But really, it can be that headache that you have. It can be even the numbness in your hands and fingers that you can't figure out. It causes all these strange symptoms: joint pain, hair loss, fatigue, anxiety, depression, um, difficulty concentrating. It's just a really long list of different symptoms that can occur. And even beyond that, some people are actually completely asymptomatic. So there is actually a small percentage of celiacs that won't show any symptoms or feel any symptoms, but the autoimmune reaction isn't occurring in their body. And that sets them up for, increased risk of other conditions. And so, as we were talking about before we got on this call, sometimes the first sign that someone has a gluten related disorder, especially celiac, is early onset osteoporosis or osteopenia. And we can definitely get into why that is, but I think it's just fascinating, and I hope that more awareness um, is raised that these conditions really have a whole body effect.
That's so important. And what I see, people who come to me young, in their 30s, all of a sudden, and then they have bone loss already, whether they have osteopenia or osteoporosis because of celiac. And they're lucky that they were diagnosed. But
Absolutely.
but as we talked about,
Mhm.
every person, right? And first of all, if they have osteoporosis, so often it depends, I think, who they see. If they're seeing an endocrinologist or a rheumatologist, there's a good chance that they will get a test for just celiac. They may not get any further testing, but they'll at least get a celiac test. But I don't know the general practitioner, or is that, when they see the DEXA scan, that they immediately send them for, I don't think so. I don't think that's one of the first things that people get tested. So why don't you explain why that should be, why everybody, if there's any question on bone density, should get a test for celiac?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Okay. So I guess I should, describe what's actually happening with celiac
Yeah.
disease. So in celiac disease, it's an autoimmune disease, meaning that gluten is the trigger for your body to start attacking itself, specifically at the small intestine. And this is a really big deal because the small intestine is where all of our nutrient absorption should happen. And when that isn't functioning, then we get nutrient deficiencies. And, very relevant to this conversation, and among the many nutrient deficiencies that can occur, are calcium, vitamin D, and vitamin K, which we know are critical for bone health. And so the longer that someone is undiagnosed, the longer that they're not absorbing these nutrients, the higher their risk is of developing osteoporosis and osteopenia. And, that's only the nutrient malabsorption part. There's also the inflammation component, which of course becomes chronic the longer you're consuming gluten and undiagnosed. And and this is also present in non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
Well, you know what?
That,
Wait, let's why don't we stop for a second?
yes.
Because it's very, very confusing to people listening. Okay, there's celiac, and celiac is, so they say, a small percentage of the population, but start with just celiac. How exactly is it diagnosed? And so they say, yes, you have celiac. No, you have non-gluten celiac. You have non-celiac gluten sensitivity.
I know it's it's a long word always. Okay, so celiac disease, it starts off by getting a blood test, and that's going to test several different antibodies. And then if that one is positive, you would go on to get an endoscopy, and that's kind of considered the gold standard right now to confirm that there is indeed damage to the small intestine and that there is indeed celiac disease. And so that would make it so you'd have a positive diagnosis. But if you went through that whole process and you didn't get answers, that's when you go on to look for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So non-celiac gluten sensitivity is a food sensitivity. It's not an autoimmune disease. However, a food sensitivity still triggers the immune system. It's just in a different way than your body actually attacking itself, but it still causes very similar inflammation. And so, at the point where you've ruled out celiac disease, you would go on to do an elimination diet, and you would take out gluten for a period of time. And if you reintroduce it and your symptoms return, then that would indicate that you do indeed have non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And so non-celiac gluten sensitivity is kind of a diagnosis of exclusion because you've already ruled out celiac disease and likely wheat allergy too. That's a good one to rule out as well. And so that's kind of the way it goes. Another kind of data or another data point that you could add to this picture is to get some genetic testing done. So there are two genes that predispose people to celiac disease. It's HLA-DQ2 and HLA-DQ8. And if you have one or both of those, then you have a chance of developing celiac disease. If you take that genetic test and you don't have either of those, then you can pretty much rule celiac disease out. And that would give you more information and more evidence that it's non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So I think that pretty much covers it in a nutshell of how you get to one place or the other.
The interesting thing I've always thought is, for celiac to be positive, the finger-like projections that are on the villi that are part of the small intestine have to be almost completely flattened. Whereas if it's just partially, that's not going to test positive. So you could be on your way to celiac, test negative, but still be, still have issues with gluten, and you're just, it keeps progressing. So I think.
Yes, that's a great point. And I think that is a flaw in testing, honestly. So thank you for bringing that. That's a great point.
It's just interesting. And then there's the antibody testing, and there's wheat tumors. There are other testings, but you're right. The easiest way is, if you're just, and the least expensive is to take it out, do the elimination, and then see what happens. But a good point that we were talking about before we started is that if you're, do not go on this before you get the celiac test. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, explain that, because that's, someone, let's say that, they're thinking, oh, maybe it's gluten. Let me do an elimination diet, and then they do the celiac testing. So why don't you explain what happens with that?
Yes. Okay. So such an important point here. The celiac test, that blood test, isn't very accurate if you've already cut out gluten. So you have to be eating gluten at the time that you take that test to get really a valid result. And oh my gosh, you are so right. So that's why, getting that test when you're still eating gluten is the first step before you do anything else. And then you can really go from there and assess, is it celiac or gluten sensitivity? So thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's something that's missed so often. And it really, I hear from a lot of people who have gone gluten-free and they didn't do any testing at the time. And then 6 months to a year later, they're really confused. Was it celiac disease? Do I have celiac disease? And I think everyone deserves to know what their root cause of their gluten issues is. And it's really important for understanding our long-term risk factors as well. If you have celiac disease, because of that genetic predisposition, it also tells you that other people in your family may also have celiac disease too, and that they should get tested even if they're asymptomatic. And there's also, the risk of getting other autoimmune conditions if you have celiac disease. And there's a higher risk of certain cancers like lymphoma and intestinal cancers. So it's really important to know kind of what you're working with here when you have a gluten issue.
It's so important. So the key thing for everybody listening who has osteopenia, osteoporosis, get the celiac test. It's not a big deal. The first part of it, the blood work at least. And I mean, not everybody has to get the endoscopy correct, just at least the blood work to begin with. Because the endoscopy is through the gastroenterologist. It's much more involved, but at least get the blood work and just make sure to rule out celiac, because if you have it, you may not know it. And why wait years for malabsorption? And it's also an interesting, so many people I've seen didn't find out. And then once they found out whether they have celiac or a gluten issue, all of a sudden their bone density, once they got rid of the gluten, their bone density improves. So it's amazing how things start to heal and start to improve. So I think this is just something for this population, or really anybody listening. If you have,
Yes.
I mean, I always tell people, well, it's funny because of my husband who had a cough. That was his symptom, a very chronic cough. And he was very sick. He was losing weight, but his body, and he had first, why don't you explain that, how you can have leaky gut first, how it doesn't just happen sometime, with the gluten. Why don't you explain how just maybe the progression with what could happen with leaky gut?
Sure, sure. So it's actually been shown that in everyone, gluten can cause leaky gut. And the way it does this is it kind of triggers the release of something called zonulin. And that causes your intestinal cells, which are usually very tightly packed together, to kind of separate and, and create these gaps. And that allows both bacterial fragments, bacterial toxins, and partially undigested food through to your bloodstream where it normally should not have access. We shouldn't have that stuff in our bloodstream normally. And that really triggers the immune system, and it reacts by really upregulating the inflammation. So that is just this huge inflammatory fire that starts from our gut. And we might not be feeling digestive symptoms from that, but it might pop up in, like you're saying, like lungs, or in our cognition, or in our joints. It really finds these other areas of the body. And so I think that kind of explains leaky gut. Sometimes I explain it too as, when you have, and this is because I work with food, when you have one of those fine mesh strainers, it may only let, these little tiny particles of flour through, but then you get one of those colanders with the larger holes in them. That would be like leaky gut. Like the colander is leaky gut, where it's letting these larger things through that shouldn't normally be there. And those really trigger the body to go into red alert.
It's so interesting because zonulin, this happens to everybody. So everybody will get increased permeability. I love that analogy. That's such a good one. I really like that with the strain. I haven't heard that one in particular. I heard cheesecloth, but I like the strainer. That's a great idea. but for everybody, it just heals up. It heals very fast. So for every person, it increases the permeability, and then it goes back until one day, possibly it doesn't. So it's not as I really believe. I mean, I don't have an issue with gluten, but I don't eat any gluten. I just don't, because I really don't think it's a health. I don't think it's healthy. I don't want to increase the permeability. But regardless, so with my husband, though, the point I was saying before was that with his coughing and with different things, is that it could be anywhere, and you just have absolutely no idea. Oh, but the funny part with my husband, so after he had this whole issue, and we realized that he had he'd been on a lot of antibiotics for the cough. That's what triggered the leaky gut. Then
Yes.
then the gluten comes in, and also the body can think it's something else. The body attacks, and he had this full-blown autoimmune response that nobody could figure out. He was able to diagnose it with a blood test for antibodies, IgG antibodies. But regardless, what happened, he's an OBGYN. And so after this, when he couldn't figure out somebody, he's like, you know what? Try going gluten-free, just see what happens. And
Yeah.
he sometimes only sees a person once a year. So they come back a year later. Oh my God, my skin cleared up. My joint pain's gone. I can lose weight. And I
Wow.
said, I wish you would keep a journal, which he didn't. But it's just unbelievable the symptoms that people were able to get rid of once they went on this elimination diet. It was amazing. He even had, vaginal pain. I mean, just so many different things.
Wow.
So I think it's something that's just a big deal that people don't even really, I mean, people do think about it, and gluten-free is, it's something that now there's so much awareness, but a lot of times
Yeah.
people think, oh yeah, they just think they just are saying they're gluten-free, or people sort of,
Yeah.
like belittle it, don't realize that it's very real, and it's a very real
Mhm.
problem. And it affects so many people. So I think this is just such an important topic for everybody to be aware of, even if they, and it's just so funny when you do the elimination diet and see what happens. Eczema is one of the big things I
Oh,
see.
yeah. Hmm.
What have you seen? What have you seen when people like disappear that people are so surprised about?
Yeah, definitely skin issues clearing up is a big one, whether it be eczema, psoriasis, um, acne. But what I really love seeing is kind of like surprise labs, or they're surprise to clients. Like for example, seeing clients with slightly elevated um, fasting blood glucose or an elevated hemoglobin A1C, which is also a measure of blood sugar balance, basically. Seeing that drop significantly after being gluten free, that is incredible. Like seeing these metabolic measures of health really improve. It's so cool seeing that on the lab work, because it's not something people expect to find. Maybe they've heard that their joint pain can improve, or that they're going to have better bowel movements, or less fatigue, but they don't expect that stuff to improve. So that's really fun.
Oh, isn't that interesting that
Yes.
you've been seeing improvements in A1C, and so the
Yes.
whole and so many people these days are reporting pre-diabetes I mean,
Yes.
it's so
Hmm.
prevalent,
Yep.
and that's very interesting. I haven't noticed that. That's really
Yeah,
wow.
that's been really exciting me lately, seeing that.
Yeah. So let's
Yeah.
talk about, okay, so someone comes to you and whether they're diagnosed with celiac or they're just trying to do a gluten-free diet but tell us how, a couple of things. Number one, the most important thing is you can't just do it sort of halfway. Oh, well, reduce it a little. Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Oh my gosh, yes. The first step is to really eliminate it 100%. It's not like keto or other diets where you might have a cheat day 1 day a week. You can't be mostly gluten free. You really have to go all in. And that includes trace amounts too. So, number one, we look at how to read labels. You have to know exactly every single thing that's in your food. Even things that don't sound like they're gluten ingredients can be derived from gluten. So you really have to master those skills first off.
Do you want to
Um,
give us an example? Like
sure.
what are some of the things that people have no idea have gluten? And when you tell them, they're like, are you kidding?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So some of the ingredients themselves that sound kind of weird would be like dextrin or modified food starch. And then some of the food products that are un, unsuspecting are, for example, shredded cheese. Sometimes they put an anti-caking agent in there that's basically a wheat-based flour to keep the shreds apart.
And
Uh,
what's the name? Is there a name to that we should look out for? Is there a certain name, or it just says anti-caking agent?
Sometimes it'll say starch, just plain starch. And if it says starch and nothing else and isn't labeled gluten-free, then we don't know if that's from wheat. Um, and so that's one. Soy sauce is a really common one that has wheat in it that people don't expect. Even something as crazy as nail polish. So, a lot of the nail strengtheners on the market have wheat protein in them, or hydrolyzed wheat protein. And if you're someone who bites their nails at all, this can be a huge problem. Or even if you're cooking a lot and a little bit chips off into the food, that can be a big problem.
Wow,
So,
that's fascinating. So, are there certain nail polishes that you recommend, or do you have to, or is it organic nail polish? What do you tell your clients who want to use nail polish?
yeah, it's mostly with the nail strengtheners.
Oh, okay.
That's usually where the red flag is. So most other nail polishes are okay, but I always give it like each brand a look. And sometimes I'll email brands too and ask if there are any gluten containing ingredients in any of their nail polishes.
Wow, because
So,
you don't see that. It's not as though a food that will say, the gluten-free label,
yeah,
right? It
exactly.
doesn't say gluten-free nail polish or nail polish strengthener. That's fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, so really gluten goes far beyond food. Everyone who is going gluten-free also needs to check their medications, their supplements, their personal care products, which is basically anything that can or does end up in the mouth, even if it's inadvertently, like sunscreen. That's also important to get gluten-free. So we really have to do this lifestyle audit when we go gluten-free and make sure that everything is safe around us. And it also includes accounting for cross-contamination. And that is basically the trace amounts of gluten that stick around, when we're sharing cookware or eating out of a shared kitchen. So for example, if I were to make a wheat bread sandwich on a cutting board, and then I were to go back later and cut an apple on that same cutting board, that apple is no longer safe for me to eat because it's likely been glutened at that point. So it's really important to check out that stuff too. There's a lot of uh, kitchen items and cooking equipment that need to be replaced when people go gluten-free, especially really porous things like cutting boards, like cast iron, toaster, of course, needs to be replaced. So that's a really important process to go through as well.
The other thing about that, you brought up so many good points, is that when you go to a restaurant, they'll say, oh, we have gluten-free pasta, but yet it's prepared in the same containers as the regular pasta.
Oh gosh. Yes. That's, oh,
You know,
drives me nuts.
I live
Yeah.
with this. So that's why this is something that I live with because my husband's incredible. We can't, same type of thing. So it's
That
just,
is a huge
yeah.
one. Yes,
And the
just
French
because,
fries,
yes.
everything that's made in a fryer or anything like that. What else is in that?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And just because they have a gluten-free menu doesn't mean that the dishes are truly gluten-free. Because if things are going on in a shared kitchen, it can be really difficult to keep things separate. And the education level around celiac disease and gluten-related disorders and how to cook safely for them is it's not as great as it could be
And you're
in the
coming
culinary
from,
world.
yeah, see, you're coming, I
Yeah.
love this because you're an insider in the culinary world.
Yeah.
So tell us about that. Because you go to a restaurant and you say, at least you sort of trust, oh, they've all been educated, but that isn't the case, is it? In
It
terms of,
isn't.
yeah, what did you find as an insider in this?
Yeah, even when I was working at that food as medicine culinary school, there was still a lack of education around this. And when you get it's a food handler's license, basically, or food handler's card to work in a restaurant, or even if you get certified as a food manager, you do some training around food allergens. But there is nothing explicit about celiac disease or gluten related disorders. And so this is really important because if you're someone who's gluten-free going to a restaurant, you have to communicate with the servers in their language. So a lot of times I'll say I have a gluten allergy because that word allergy resonates with them, whereas the word celiac may not. And so they have some training around food allergens, even though celiac disease is not a true allergy. I use that word at restaurants because it's the best way to get my point across.
It's so funny. We do the exact opposite because we found if you say, oh, he has gluten, this is just what we found, he has an issue with gluten or they always say celiac. And we just say yes, because his is not celiac, but we say yes because they get celiac. So maybe it's different. I don't know. For some reason, the word celiac, they realize has more serious or whatever. That's interesting. But maybe we didn't say allergy per se. Very interesting.
But that actually makes me happy. That makes me really happy that you used the word celiac and that was taken seriously. That's wonderful. You're going to good places.
So I guess that's why the work you do is so important. So when you have people, you really educate them. And that's, I guess, the most important thing that you're educated and you understand.
Yeah, it's all about how to navigate this gluten-free lifestyle. And beyond kind of the physical considerations and how to truly eliminate gluten, how to start healing our gut, I think it's also important to talk about the social and emotional impacts of making this lifestyle change. because, a lot of people will come to me and say that their new dietary and health needs make them feel like an inconvenience on others or like a burden to others. And to be honest, I felt that way at one point too. It can be really awkward and really uncomfortable, having to advocate for yourself in social gatherings and at restaurants. Can really feel like you're the odd one out. But, I think it's such an invitation for a lot of inner work and for really getting grounded in our self-worth and realizing that we're the only ones in our body and the only ones who can really protect it and take care of it. And so I really think going gluten-free goes so much further than we even anticipate that it will. It brings, so much personal development as well.
Wow, that's really
And
beautifully said. And I know what that's like, because what I do now, I have a daughter getting married, and my son got married not that long ago. And on the invitation, we actually put, any food allergies, because that's been the hardest at a wedding, when there is, all everything's laid out in the appetite, all of the, when the hors d'oeuvre hour,
yes.
we have to find a person like the Matrix, find someone what's gluten free, what's not. And then it's possible none of the dishes. I mean, now I think
Yes.
people are, but you really need to call the people beforehand. This is what we found, and see, my
Mhm.
husband, you don't want to be a pain, but how horrible to be at a wedding and not be able to eat one thing. And
Right.
so, if you call ahead of time and just explain, people really, or call the person who's having the wedding, people really do understand that nobody wants you to be sick. And so, yeah, but it's not, let's just tell people it's not so terrible, right?
It isn't.
No.
It so isn't.
I think the silver lining, I'm a big person in silver linings. And what I see, and this is how my whole philosophy on on everything really, is that besides, I mean, as I said, gluten really isn't healthy for anyone, but cutting out all that bread, cutting out all of these things leaves room for healthier food. And all of a sudden you have more energy, you're happier, your life just could be so much better. And so there certainly is a really bright side to this.
Oh, for sure. Yes. And I think as we see our health improve from being gluten-free, it becomes more and more of a motivator to keep going. And I think we become so grateful for our health after we've been in a really rough spot, and we make this dietary tweak and it changes our lives. It's amazing.
It's so interesting. There's one person I'm thinking of in particular who, for no reason, now she had osteoporosis, she was on medication, nothing seemed to be helping her, but she didn't really have any, so she didn't think she had any symptoms, but she did have arthritis, and she didn't correlate as you get older. People, everybody thinks no big deal, it's just part of aging. And then she, just because a friend of hers went gluten free, she just decided. And within 2 weeks, her joint pain was totally gone. And then
Oh my
I think
gosh.
even the next time she got her DEXA scan, her bone density significantly increased. And it's just so interesting. People just don't realize what a big to do this is.
Yeah, that's incredible. That's so incredible and so
But
inspiring to see, on a practitioner end of it.
yeah, but as working with people with osteoporosis, this is so critical. And the good news is that the doctors do recognize celiac disease. So anybody working with osteoporosis, I mean, it was very interesting because I was at a big meeting with doctors, conventional doctors who really deal with osteoporosis, and celiac is absolutely, all of them test for celiac. But I had asked a question. I said, well, what about people who don't have celiac but have non-gluten sensitivity? Oh, we don't really
Mm.
look at that.
Oh
And
no.
that's the
Okay.
majority of people. So I think that, yes, everybody should be tested for celiac, critical. And especially, as you're saying, young, and on the opposite end, just like you said, younger people who have celiac must be followed for their bone health, because they could be at
Yes.
risk for osteoporosis. So it goes both
Mhm.
ways. But it's just not recognized, the other part, that's where which affects so many more people as well.
Oh my gosh, yes. And non-celiac gluten sensitivity is very well documented in the medical literature, and yet sometimes it's still not recognized by certain providers. But yes, It is very much a real thing, so much so. And it's so important for these kinds of conditions like osteoporosis because, when you have something that causes chronic inflammation, your body just does not have the time or resources to spend on things like bone formation and your bone density suffers because of it. So, yes, I'm so glad that um, you're recognizing both, that we can talk about both here and give both the respect that they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, two
Mhm.
questions I have for you. Number
Yes.
one, well, do you ever use the enzymes preventatively? Like, do you ever use any of the enzymes that block gluten as just like a secondary, not, obviously we avoid the food, but do you ever recommend that in terms of what's your
You
thought on
know,
that?
for celiac disease, I don't recommend them as much, but there has been some promising evidence for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So in those cases, I do say that they perhaps can be helpful. I think they're worth giving a try.
Yeah, because for us,
Yeah.
that really does seem to work since it blocks like 98% of the gluten. So when we go out for restaurants, it's just a huge help to have, the one we use is Dr. Tom O'Brien's product, which really seems to be so incredibly helpful. But okay, my second question is, as a culinary expert, tell us your favorite tweaks. So what, instead, because I was looking at some of your recipes and they look absolutely delicious on your website. They
Oh,
look
thank
yummy.
you.
So what are
Thank
your
you.
favorite tweaks when you're not using, let's say what, just in terms of your basic tweaks that you use, if you're trying to bake, let's say you're making, because
Mhm.
you had a blueberry crisp that looked really good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so baking is often the biggest challenge when going gluten-free, but I think it's fun. Like I think it's such a great place to be creative and try different flours. And so some of my favorites are, I guess for sweet baking, I really like almond flour because it has kind of that moist texture. It has a really mild and delicate flavor, and you can use it in a lot of different things. It really doesn't overwhelm with a flavor of its own. So, really love almond flour. It's really tasty, and there are countless of amazing almond flour recipes online. And then for more like savory baking, I'm really liking recently chickpea flour. And so, what I sometimes do with that is make something called soka. And it's a Mediterranean flatbread recipe where you make it in a cast iron pan, actually. And it's really, really thin, and you bake it. And I've actually used that as a type of pizza crust before. So,
Oh,
yeah, that one's been really fun. But I really encourage everyone to experiment with gluten free flours. Sometimes you're going to get flops. I still have flops, but it's all about, the process of it and trying new things. And you eventually find the ones that you really love.
sounds good. And the other thing I liked about your recipes, because just oftentimes, gluten-free is extremely unhealthy. So as a nutritionist, just when something says gluten-free does not, right, mean it's healthy. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So when people are first transitioning to gluten free, often a good place to start is doing kind of those one-to-one subs of gluten free alternatives. So, for example, if you were eating bread before, crackers, doing a gluten free bread or cracker in place of that. But I really encourage people to not stay there forever because in honesty, a lot of the gluten-free alternatives are actually less healthy than their wheat-based alternatives. And, it's a kind of a lot of empty starches sometimes that don't have much nutritional value. And if you're anyone who's had issues with inflammation or you have nutrient deficiencies from celiac disease, you need all the nutrition you can get. So that's where it becomes really important to think about the nutrient density of your diet. Think about how many nutrients can I possibly pack into each meal, and that might mean something like instead of using a gluten-free bread, trying something like sweet potato toast that you basically bake these thin slabs of sweet potato, and then you layer them up with toppings. And So that's like a really nutrient dense substitute for a gluten-free bread. Or maybe instead of noodles, you try spaghetti squash or zucchini noodles, or maybe you do half and half, a half brown rice noodle and half zucchini noodles. And, I think it's just really important to think of ways that we can really maximize the nutritional value of every meal because our body is really looking for that, especially when we have any kind of inflammatory condition like non-celiac gluten sensitivity or an autoimmune condition like celiac disease. And if we add something like osteoporosis on top of that, then it's even more important to get nutrition in every meal. So that's my thought on it.
Such amazing good advice. So I want these recipes. Oh, sweet potato toast. I have to surprise my husband with that. That sounds incredible. So
Oh yeah.
how do you work with people? How do you, why don't you make your own recipe book, Maya? I think your own cookbook.
I believe I haven't done that. I do love cooking so much. Yeah, I really should do that. So the way that I work with people is right now I have a small 6-week group program, and that is for anyone who's been newly diagnosed with celiac or gluten sensitivity, and they're trying to figure it all out. They're trying to figure out the label reading, cross contamination, setting up a safe kitchen, and interested in getting the fundamentals of starting their gut repair journey. And then the other way I work with people is one-on-one, and that's more if they've been gluten free for a while, but they're still having digestive issues. So they're still struggling with constipation, diarrhea, gas, bloating, and just wondering what's going on. It can be really frustrating if you've cut out gluten but are still having symptoms. So that's where I really help people one on one.
Oh, that's great. And all that information is, want to give everyone your website?
Sure, yes. My website is gutrevivalnutrition.com. And I also have a private Facebook group that is they can find on the website. And I'm most active on my Instagram, which is at gluten.free.nutritionist. And I love, posting silly things, educational things, connecting with people on there. So
And
hope to.
where may I find that amazing recipe of sweet potato toast?
Yeah. So that's on my Instagram actually. And the one that I posted on there was sweet potato toast layered with baba ganoush, which is a
Mm,
Mediterranean eggplant dip with crispy chickpeas on top.
wow. Now, one other question before we end. So my husband does bake, and he was always a baker before he became gluten-free. So, but he puts, what I don't like what he does is he puts sugar in, but I see on your recipes you use honey. Is that typically, what do you use to sweeten things? Because yours are much healthier than his version, which I would,
Oh.
I don't believe if it's organic sugar. I'm a person who doesn't take any, I don't really want to add processed sugar to to my food. So what do you recommend?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that cane sugar isn't the best for our gut microbiome. So I usually use honey, sometimes maple syrup, sometimes dates, and sometimes coconut sugar. But I do honestly really love honey. It has a really delicious flavor, in my opinion, and it carries a lot of special things, special enzymes that other sweeteners don't necessarily have. But dates are great too because dates have a lot of fiber in them.
That's a great
So
idea. So you chop up the dates then when you, yeah.
you can, or you can even puree them into kind of a
Mm.
date syrup. That one's really tasty. It's kind of caramely.
Wow. I'm just thinking because prunes are so good for osteoporosis. I wonder if you can even,
Oh, ooh.
put prunes in.
Oh, I love that. Oh my gosh. Yes, I've actually made a gluten-free chocolate cake that had prunes in it before. It was pureed prunes and it made it really moist and yummy.
Oh, interesting. And the honey. So what honey do you use? Do you use the honey? Is it already more liquid? Is there one that you recommend for your baking? Because you can get it different ways. Sometimes it's pretty hard. Sometimes it's much. Is there one that you find easiest when you're cooking?
Yeah, I don't really think about the consistency as much as the quality of the honey. I really like to get raw and organic honey, and if you can get it local, that's the best. That can actually, in some cases, help with allergies sometimes if you have seasonal allergies.
Ah,
Um,
So
Yes.
interesting. Oh, so I could talk to you for hours on all your little tweaks, but I'm going to go to your Instagram and get some of these
Aw.
recipes. And yeah, no, because you sort of get stuck in your ways. So it's really great to get some new yummy gluten-free recipes. And I was so impressed with even your website. That blueberry looked so good.
Thank you. I so believe that food is one of life's many pleasures, and we all deserve to have that, even if we're gluten free, or even if we have other dietary restrictions. Like, we all deserve that.
That's such a great way to end because it's true. You can become more creative and healthier because as you search, you find new exciting things like your blueberry or like, I just never even thought of sweet potato bread. That's so interesting.
Oh, it's so tasty.
Yeah. Is there any last minute things you want to share before we end?
Oh gosh, I think this was so wonderful, and I think that's about it for
Yeah, I
me.
think
But
what you said was so good. Was so good. We should end it on that that everybody deserves. Everybody deserves. And I teach happiness, so I believe that you deserve to be happy, and there's no reason that you can't figure this out and be happier, healthier, and even eat better
Mm,
food than before, right?
yeah, Margie, I love your happiness work so much. I think that in itself is so nourishing for the gut. So many people are struggling with stress, and happiness is the best antidote for that.
It's
So
true. I so agree. I so agree. But your food makes people happy, so it all goes together. Anyway, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, and I look
thank
forward to staying in
you.
touch.
Thank you so much for having me. This was
Oh,
wonderful.
my pleasure. Bye bye. Hey, Margie here. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the world of gluten because there can be so many negative consequences when it comes to our bones and overall health. And we've addressed this on the podcast, but I want to go deeper today. And we have a very special guest, Maya Rose. And Maya is a nutritionist who helps celiac and gluten sensitive women stop getting gluten and start healing their gut. As a fellow celiac who's struggled with digestive issues for many years, she treats clients with the empathy and specialized care she wished she had received. She takes a joy-based, non-dogmatic approach to nutrition and hopes to show others how nourishing and fulfilling a gluten-free life can be. And in today's talk, we really go into the relationship between bone health and issues with gluten, such as celiac disease, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and really why it matters and why all of us should be concerned about it. It's filled with great information. And as a person who's had experience in the culinary world, Maya gives us some great tools and some great swaps and really just some great information. So stay tuned.